All right, good morning, church. Good to see you. We obviously started fall, I guess, officially, technically. So with that comes pumpkin spice everything, and you've probably seen that. And the weather got a little cooler, and of course, we always get our false hopes of here's fall, then it goes back to blistering heat. So we're not quite sure if we're in fall yet, but it is that time of year. Glad you're here this morning. If you're a visitor with us, we hope that you can stick around and we can meet you afterwards. And so don't run off. Let us meet you after services here. We hope this service is a blessing to you. We're finishing up this series here this morning. We've been calling it Coffee Mug Christianity, bringing clarity to cliches, where some of you have referred to it, Aaron ruins your favorite verse. And we're going to we looked at John 3:16 the first week, we looked at Philippians 4:13 in week 2. Last week we looked at the ever popular Jeremiah 29:11. This morning it's not one that's necessarily a coffee mug verse, but it is one that is quoted and misquoted a lot. And I actually see it quoted more by non-believers, non-Christians, sometimes more than I do Christians. And so I want to bring that up here in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to present to you the honorable mentions. These are the ones that didn't make the cut, that we could have done a lesson on, but we just didn't. And maybe we can revisit this at a later time, but right now I just point them out to you. So one of the ones that we could have looked at, Romans 8:28, we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. A lot of times we get that wrong. And we think, well, only good things. That's all that God wants for me is good things. And His purpose, He's told us that there's good that's going to come out of it. But like we looked at last week, sometimes that good, that promise of good, of all things being good, may not be on this side of heaven. You may not see it in your lifetime. And so sometimes we take this verse out of context. Now the next one, I almost did today's lesson on this next one. And at the last second, I told Joel, I said, hey, we're going to switch it up, and I decided to do a different passage. But I really was going to look at this one out of 2 Chronicles 7 and verse 14. You probably see this a lot, especially around election time. People like to throw this on their Facebook walls and misquote it. And we don't take into context any of this at all. Because right before this, there's talk about famine and pestilence, and we don't look at that. We just look at verse 14 because we like verse 14 because it sounds nice. If my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. You should know, he's not talking about the United States of America. This is not a promise for us. I see people grab this verse and go, well, if we would just seek God, if we would just pray to God, then God's going to bless us. Well, yes, you should seek God and you should turn to God. And yes, you could argue that maybe we were founded on Christian principles as far as a country. But that doesn't mean that God is going to bless us. That's not a promise for us. He's never said, I will bless the United States of America. I will bless you. We looked at this last week. A lot of times, the Christian life is not one of blessing and prosperity, but of hardship. Difficult. And so we like to throw this verse out there. He's not talking about our nation. We like to use it and say, well, if we'll just be what we should be, if we're just good Americans and we pray to God, then He's going to bless us. You don't have that promise. Here's the one I want us to look at. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 7. And I don't know about you, when I was growing up, if you had a sick day or you were playing hooky or whatever it was, you would stay home from school and you'd watch TV. Usually them at The Price is Right? We've all seen that, staying home. We watch Price is Right. But there's also a lot of these courtroom shows. And I don't know why, but I just always remember seeing the People's Court on TV. Did you ever watch that show? So it was always interesting to me. They'd have these people go into the courtroom, and there's a lot of different courtroom shows and a lot of different courtroom movies, and I like a lot of them. All that John Christian stuff, I like those kind of movies. But there's very few shows that center directly on the judge. And there are a few exceptions. People's Court was one of those. And so they would have the judge, they would hear both sides of an argument, and then the judge would make this ruling. And I always thought it was funny afterwards, they would go and interview these people in the hallway. They're like, hey, what'd you think about that verdict, And people say, well, I didn't like it, or I just thought the judge wouldn't listen to me, and all this stuff. And it was just it's just an interesting show. And so there's shows like that feature judges. There's also, in more recent times, we've seen Judge Judy, people like that. They have their own shows. And so it's all about the judge in these instances passing judgment on someone else. And so we're used to this idea. We understand what it is to pass judgment, to have people who judge. And so we're going to be looking at this passage in Matthew chapter 7, and we're going to start there in verse 1. And we're going to read through this passage and talk about exactly what Jesus is saying here. Because again, sometimes we see this verse used, and a lot of times it's not in the correct context. And so we want to do that this morning. Matthew 7, starting in verse 1. Jesus says, "Do not judge, so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, hey, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet, and turn and tear you to pieces. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. What man is there among you when his son asks for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you. For this is the law and the prophets." There's an interesting thing there, because he starts talking about judgment, and then he kind of goes off into this idea, this topic of prayer. And sometimes we think that that's just a complete break from what he said about judgment. I don't think that it is. I think he's talking about prayer in this instance, at this moment in his Sermon on the Mount, because he's making us understand we need spiritual discernment. That's what he's talking about, is being able to judge and have discernment. And so he goes into this idea about prayer. And then he bookends this section. He goes back to, in verse 12, again, talking about relationships and how we treat other people. And so he says, treat people the way you want them, you want to be treated yourself. So here's the idea I want us to think about this morning. We're going to go through and look at the different types of judgments that are in the Bible. We won't look at all of them, but it's just kind of give us a good start. So I want us to think about this idea that you and I will be judged by how we judge. And that's not just saying the way that we judge others, although that's implied and that's included, but it's also about us being able to judge right and wrong and what we're going to do with Jesus. We make all kinds of judgments all the time. And if we don't make the right judgments, if we don't judge in the right way, they can jeopardize our relationship with God and our eternal destination. And so, yes, it includes how we judge others, but there's also other judgments that we have to make in life. And so we'll go through and look at these. So when you look at different types of judgment, one of these types of judgment is a judicial type of judgment. That's the first type. And so judicial, this is kind of going back to those courtroom shows. People's Court, Judge Judy. We understand in those contexts, there is someone who makes a ruling. You have a proper authority who is passing sentence on somebody else. This is a judicial judgment. We understand it. We accept it. Okay, we understand what this is about. And so if you think about it, church discipline will also fall into this type of judgment. There are times where we have to make judgments, judicial decisions in the church when dealing with people in the church. So one of these examples is in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And so here Paul says, I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother if he is an immoral person, or covetous, or an idolater, or a viler, or a drunkard, or a swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Do you not judge those who are within the church? Well, we kind of have a little problem here. Because Jesus says, don't judge. And Paul says, yes, judge. And I'm not going to go into all the different ins and outs of the Greek usages and the Greek words here. I just want to point out to you the different types of judgment in their context, and I think we can understand from that the different types of judgment. So here he says you have to judge others within the church if they are in sin. And he points out these things. He mentions immoral, covetous, idolater, drunkard, swindler. Well, don't you have to make a judgment about somebody to know that they are in that position, that they are in that sin? And then he says, do you not judge those who are within the church? And so we have a right to do that. We have a right to judge those within the church if we see that they are in sin. He will go on to say, but those who are outside, those outside the church, God judges. And then he says, remove the wicked man from among yourself. He's talking about church discipline. He's saying, deal with this person. Deal with these individuals. And it's not, he says here, those who are outside, God judges. That's not to say that God doesn't judge the ones on the inside. What he's saying is God is going to judge those people on the outside. You need to make sure you judge those on the inside, because if they are not living according to the church, then you need to deal with them. And so in that sense, it's a judicial judgment, and yes, it can be done by us, and it's okay. It's not a sin to do that. Another type of judgment is what we might call factual assessments. These are very simple. You do this every day. You do this all the time. And so what a factual assessment is we look at something and we say, okay, is this right? Is this wrong? Is this accurate? Is this inaccurate? Is this a good move? Is this a bad move? We make those kind of assessments all the time. And so we make those judgments. We sometimes use that word judgment. We think of maybe discernment might be a better word for us. But we make those kind of assessments all day long. I have to choose between two things. Is one good? Is one bad? Which one am I going to choose? A part of a factual assessment is just being able to look at the things presented to you, and you have to pick one way or the other. Jesus does this himself in the exact same text. So he's talking about he's talking about kind of a hyperbole situation, but he's using this idea of a plank or a 2x4 sticking out of somebody's eye, and then you got a speck in somebody else's eye. Well, those are factual things. He's saying, I noticed this, but you have this. He also says in verse 6, do not give what is holy to dogs. Well, we have to make an assessment there, right? What's holy? What's unholy? Who are the dogs? So we have to make a factual assessment when we look at that. And so sometimes we say, well, Jesus said don't judge, but then later on in the passage, he's saying you still have to make judgments. And so we have to make sure that we're looking at this in the context. One of the types of a factual assessment is also along the lines of being able to look at things and make a judgment when it comes to moral issues. And so there's a lot of different passages that we can look at. For this one, I just picked out one for you here in Ephesians chapter 5. And Paul says here, do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but rather instead expose them, for it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. But all things become visible when they are exposed by the light, for everything that becomes visible is light. So, he's saying you're going to have to make some decisions. Is something, a temptation, activity, is that going to hurt or help my relationship with God? We have to make moral judgments. Paul classifies them as darkness and light, talks about that contrast, and so we have to make decisions sometimes and say, well, if I do this, I'm hurting my relationship with God. It's a deed of the darkness, but if I do this, it's according to the light. It's according to what God would have me to do. So we have to make moral judgments. Another type of judgment is this one here in Matthew chapter 7, the way he starts the chapter, and that's hypocritical judgment. You'll notice so far, the first three we're allowed to do. In some cases, we're even commanded to do. But when we get to the hypocritical judgment that Matthew 7 verses 1 and 2 talks about, that is the kind that we are not to engage in. This is what Jesus is talking about, this hypocritical judgment, this harsh, condemning judgment of a brother or sister. And so Judicial, yes. Church discipline, we have to deal with those things. Factual assessments, we do it all day long. Every week we do this. Moral, sometimes we have to choose. Is this going to hurt my relationship with God or not? We're okay with those, but once we get to the hypocritical level, Jesus says, that's off limits. Don't judge people in that way. Now the final one is just exactly that, final judgment. And we understand that there is going to be a final judgment at the end of time. And so we get to passages where we can talk about 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10, where Paul says we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Pretty simple. We are all going to face a final judgment. Peter says, and he ties this in, I think, really well. He says, the end of all things is near. Therefore, this is who you should be. Therefore, be of sound judgment. We're going to have to make judgments in life. And Peter says here, you need to make sound judgments because the end of all things is near. The final judgment is coming. And so you need to be able to make good decisions. He also talks about a sober spirit. And he says, for the purpose of prayer. And sometimes we might look at that and say, well, that's kind of interesting that he would say that we have to be of sound judgment and sober spirit in order to pray. But again, I think it goes back to what Jesus was saying in Matthew 7. We need spiritual discernment. We need spiritual wisdom. We just got through finishing a few months ago an entire series on the book of Proverbs. We desperately need wisdom. We need discernment. And one of the ways that we grow in our discernment and being able to judge in the right way is to be connected to God. We do that through prayer. And so here Peter says, the judgment's coming, the end of all things is near, so have sound judgment so that you can be connected to God and you can continue to have this relationship with Him. And so yes, it is important how we judge others, but it's also important how we judge just everyday things in life. We need to determine how is this going to affect my relationship with God. I hear people say all the time, perhaps you've seen it. I see it a lot on social media. If you ever get on Facebook or anything like that, you'll have people going back and forth making comments. And invariably, at some point, someone will say, I'm a Christian, or they'll make known that they are a Christian in some way or another. And then another person who they are arguing with will say, oh yeah, well what gives you the right to judge me? Or, you can't judge me unless you're perfect. So if you're not perfect, then you can't say anything, right? We hear these type of remarks. How dare you judge me? And a lot of times people will throw out Matthew 7. They may not know any other Bible verse, but it seems like non-Christians really, really know that one, don't they? They say, well, don't judge lest you be judged. And yes, we shouldn't be judging people in a hypocritical way that Jesus is talking about. But I would say when it comes to the church, and when it comes to your own relationship with God, when the truth matters, sometimes we have to make these judgments. We have to make these decisions. And so in those instances, you are allowed to judge. If we think about the gospel story, if we think about the message that we're trying to share with other people, the gospel at its core is a message of judgment. You can't have good news without there also being on the other side bad news, right? If there's no bad news, there's no good news. And so we have the good news, but we also have, here's what happens if you don't accept. And that is the bad news. That is the judgment. And so we have to understand that this is what we wrestle with as Christians. We're trying to share the gospel with the world who doesn't necessarily accept this. The world is going to end with a judgment. And people who do not accept it need to be able to recognize that. We need to point this out to people. Look, we may not see it our lifetimes, but we know the judgment is coming. We know that we have to get ready. So when we share the gospel, people say, well, that's not very attractive. I don't like that idea that there is judgment coming, that God is going to judge me. Well, He's going to judge everyone. And so our ability to judge this good news and accept it is going to be the difference in our eternal destination. So we need to impress that on other people. Now let me give you one final aspect of this, because sometimes I think we overlook this. And I don't know if you agree with this, but I think it's pretty spot on that sometimes when it comes to our mistakes, we are really, really, really good lawyers. And when it comes to other people's mistakes, we're really, really good judges. Or at least we think so. I don't have a problem with us judging other people church. If we see that someone is caught in sin, we should deal with it. This goes back to the text of Matthew 18, right? Jesus says there's a procedure for this. He says if you see a brother or sister caught in sin, you go talk to them about it, you confront them about it, and if they don't listen to you, you bring 2 or 3 others with you, and if they don't listen to them, then you tell the church. And so we are told, we are commanded to do this. What we are not told to do is to have this hypocritical, this harsh, condemning judgment of one another when we have not, in fact, taken care of ourselves. And so it's important that if we are going to judge other people, that we need to be careful and make sure that we have judged ourselves appropriately first. So here's a couple different things about this. This one can fall into that idea of church discipline, of judicial judgment. But there's another little aspect here that Paul will put on the end. He says, brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. So you see here, there's some church discipline going on. There's a judicial type of judgment going on. We have to make an assessment, a judgment, and say that this person is caught in sin. So you've made a judgment at that point. But notice what he says at the end. Each one looking to yourself so that you too will not be tempted. And so yes, it's okay to point those things out. But we also need to be looking inwardly and making sure that we are standing in front of the mirror and being honest about our own shortcomings, and our own mistakes, and our own sin. One more. Paul will say in 2 Corinthians 13, test yourselves to see if you are in the faith. Examine yourselves. Or do you not recognize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail the test. But I trust that you will realize that we ourselves do not fail test. It goes back to people making that argument. Well, you have no right to judge me. Unless you're perfect, you can't judge me. Well, none of us are going to be perfect, and yet we're commanded to judge in certain situations. So we can throw that out. We are allowed to judge. What we're not allowed to do is be hypocritical and point out flaws in another person when we ourselves are caught up in those same things, and sometimes even worse. That's why Jesus uses that analogy of a speck in a log. So we need to make sure, before we start judging other people, that we judge ourselves as well. That doesn't mean that you have to be in a position of perfection before you judge someone else. It just means that you need to make sure that you're not being hypocritical in your judgment. That if you're going to judge someone else and point out a flaw to them, that you too need to look at yourselves before you do that. So here's a few things as far as application. We are allowed to judge the things that will affect our relationship with God or things that will affect the church. So whether it's making a moral choice and saying, I judge that this, or I discern that this is not a good choice for me, but this over here is a good choice. Whether it's that, and it's our personal relationship with God, or if it is related to church discipline and judicial judgment, we also are allowed to do that. We're able to get those things. If it's a problem in the church, we want to deal with it. And Paul says you have a right to make a judgment in that way. What we can't do is we cannot judge others hypocritically or harshly. We can't condemn them and say, well, look at you. And we haven't even looked at ourselves. We're doing the exact same thing. So we need to be careful. I would say, if you can get by with not judging people, by all means don't. But if you have to, we need to make sure we're doing it in a biblical context, that we are doing it according to either our relationship ourselves with God or things that will affect the health and the well-being of the church. Everything else is probably going to be this hypocritical, condemning type of judgment. Sometimes we look at other people and we say, well, here's what I think about this person, or we make up an image in our mind of what we think this person is like. We haven't even, as the saying goes, walked a mile in their shoes. We don't know their story. We don't know their backstory. And if we're honest, if you look at your life and you go back and look at your past and pick any number of things that you were ashamed of, sins that you did, if someone from this church were to show up in that moment in which you committed that act and they said, hey, you don't need to be doing this, or they judged you on it, well, that would be unfair, wouldn't it? Because we all have those moments where if people walk in on a certain part of a certain chapter in our story, yes, we're probably going to have some problems. So it's not fair to judge the whole book. just because you happen to see one part of one person's story, one part of the chapter. We have to be very careful in the way that we handle this, because Jesus is saying, if you are judging in this way, you will be judged like that in return. And so we have to be careful about how we judge others. We also need to understand, look, the day is coming. We are going to face final judgment. Every single one of us. Paul says you will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And so I talked about this on Wednesday night. We were looking at Romans 14, and we talked about the weak and the strong and bearing your brother's burdens and making sure you're not stumbling block to him and things like that. We talked about this idea. Before you go and you start pointing out things in your brother, you better make sure you're right. Because sometimes we point out things of others because it's just so much easier, right? And I think it makes us feel better if we're honest. We think, well, if I can just point out this person's flaws, then it makes me feel like a better person. And we could be messing up just as much as them, but if we magnify what they're doing, then it makes us feel a little bit better. So we can't do that. We have to make sure that we are assessing and being honest about our own lives. And how much better would we be if we went to God in prayer instead of going to our brother with judgment? Think about the type of fellowship that we would have if instead of judging other people, we would reach out to people and we would love people and realize, I'm not going to judge you for this thing in your life, but I do want to help you. I do want to help you get out of that. How much better would the church be if we had that mindset? There was a story of a preacher, and for about a month straight, he just hammered into his congregation lessons about judgment and how judgment was coming. And over and over and over again in his lessons, for 4 straight weeks, he kept saying, someday there's a payday. And he'd say, someday, payday. And he kept impressing this onto them. They kind of got sick of it because they're like, oh my goodness, he's going with that phrase again. You might feel the same way with some of the stuff that I say in the pulpit. You go, oh, here we go again. I've heard him say that before. And he just kept saying that. Someday, payday. There was a man in that congregation who heard those words, who heard all those lessons, was there each week, and he was a recovering alcoholic. And he went into the convenience store, and he grabbed a 30-pack, and he was heading to the register, and he decided that he wanted to get a snack. Probably know where I'm going with this. He walks over to the candy aisle, and he pulls out a payday candy bar. He sees it's there sitting on the counter. And it immediately just hit him. And just the sight of that little candy bar made him reflect on the choices that he was making in his life. And he hated it, but he heard that preacher's words ringing in the back of his mind, someday, payday. And he went and made the decision. And he went and put that beer back up. And he walked out of that store. And he realized it was not worth it to possibly lose his job, to possibly lose his family, and to also face the judgment of God. He said, I don't want to face Jesus that way. And so from that day forward, he made a change in his life. Whether we like it or not, we are going to be judged on how we judge. Sometimes it's the judgments we have of others. Sometimes it's the judgments that we make in moral situations or in the church situation. But we will all be judged by how we judge in our lives. When we think about what Jesus has done for us, He's given us the opportunity to have a relationship with Him, to have forgiveness of sins. And that we are now a family. And so as a family, let's spend less time judging one another and more time loving one another. And let's be people who can wisely discern when we're faced with these judgments this week. Let's pray together, please. Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for moments like this where we can come together and praise you, to read your word, to gather around the table and be reminded of the great cost, the great sacrifice that Jesus made on our behalf. Father, if we're honest, we are We're not very good at judging things. We like to think that we are, but we're human, we're imperfect, and sometimes we make judgments of others that are unfair, that are harsh, that are condemning. Father, we ask that you would remove these attitudes from our lives, that you would help us to be people who would love one another, that would help and encourage one another, rather than looking down on someone else. Help us also to understand that there are times in our lives that we will encounter, even this week, where we will have to make judgments. We will have to discern between one situation or another. Father, help us to seek you and to seek your word, to seek your wisdom, that we might make good choices, that we might be good judges of the things that we are presented with in our lives. We thank you that you have rescued us, that you have provided an escape from sin and condemnation, that you have allowed us to have the hope of heaven. We thank you for the sacrifice of Christ, and it's through his name that we pray.